Okay. Lean in close. I need you to picture this. It's the kind of sterile, silent room that seems to swallow sound. A juvenile courtroom. The air is cold, smelling of lemon-scented disinfectant and old wood. And in that silence, a judge, a woman with a face etched with the weariness of 1,000 bad decisions, is speaking. She's pronouncing the sentence. 7 years. For taking a life. 7 years in a secure youth facility, with the possibility of parole in just a few. And as the weight of this insult to justice settles over the victim's family, the boy in question, Leo Thorne, does something unbelievable. He looks directly at the Honorable Judge Whitaker. A slow, deliberate smile spreads across his 15-year-old face. And he laughs. It's not a hysterical laugh. It's a soft, confident, chilling sound that cuts through the silence. A puff of air that says, clearer than any words, I win. Now, at this point, you'd think this is the worst of it, right? The ultimate arrogance. But what if I told you the real story isn't about the crime, or the trial, or even that laugh? What happens when a monster so young, so arrogant, believes his victory is absolute, and he has completely failed to account for a pain that operates outside of all the rules? Before we step back into the past and see how we got to this moment, I have to ask you, where are you watching from right now? It's a quiet, rain-soaked night here where I'm recording, the kind of night that makes you pull the curtains closed. If you're ready to see what happens when justice decides to take matters into its own hands, make sure you're subscribed. Because we're about to walk a long, dark road together. Let's rewind. Let's go back to the beginning, to the perfectly manicured lawns and the silent, screaming houses of Crestmere Bluffs. Because to understand the fall, you first have to see the height from which he jumped. So, let me take you to Crestmere Bluffs. You've seen a place like it, even if you've never been there. It's the kind of suburb that doesn't just look wealthy, it looks resolved. Finished. As if every decision about paint color, tree height, and lawn fertilizer was put to a vote and passed unanimously. Drive through the gates. Yes, there are tasteful, wrought iron gates, and the first thing you notice is the silence. It's not a peaceful silence. It's a heavy, pressurized quiet, broken only by the distant, rhythmic hiss of sprinkler systems tickling emerald green lawns. These aren't just lawns. They're declarations of war against any single, stray dandelion. The houses are all variations on a theme of perfection. Big, modern boxes with glass walls, or sprawling traditional homes with columns so white they hurt to look at in the midday sun. Every driveway is paved with smooth, sealed asphalt, not a crack in sight. And the cars? They're all sleek, silent electric vehicles, washed daily, looking like they just rolled out of a showroom. No minivans with sticky Cheerio residue here. No, sir. Now, take a deep breath. What do you smell? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The air is scrubbed clean by the sea breeze and filtered through a forest of money. There's no scent of cooking from an open window, no smell of a neighbor's barbecue. It's as if the very atmosphere has been sanitized. But if you look closer, and I mean really look, you start to see the cracks in the foundation. And I'm not talking about real cracks. Those get repaired by a landscaping crew before the sun sets. I'm talking about the human cracks. See that woman jogging at 6:05 a.m. on the dot? Her outfit costs more than my microphone, and her smile is as tight as the skin on her forehead. She's not jogging for joy, she's running from something. Maybe the silence in her own home. Look at the man in that glass-walled office, on a Zoom call. His laugh a little too loud, a little too performative. He's not just selling stocks. He's selling the image of a man who has it all figured out. And the kids? They're the most polished of all. They don't ride bikes. They have scheduled cycling practice. They don't play in the street. They attend curated playdates. Their futures are already mapped out on a spreadsheet. Ivy League, internship, corner office. There's no room for mess. No room for error. And certainly no room for a boy who doesn't fit the mold. This is Crestmere Bluffs. A beautiful, gilded cage. A kingdom built on the bedrock of appearance. And it's in a place like this, where every outward sign screams control and order, that the most chaotic, uncontrollable impulses fester. Because when you're told your entire life that the surface is all that matters, You never bother to learn how to handle what's boiling underneath. This is where our story begins. In this perfect, quiet, beautiful kingdom. Right before the explosion. Now, in the center of this perfect kingdom, in a house that was all sharp angles and cold glass, lived our prince. His name was Leo Thorne. And if Crestmere Bluffs was a masterpiece of appearance, then Leo was its most brilliant and terrifying creation. To everyone else, Leo was just quiet. A 15-year-old prodigy. The kind of kid who made teachers feel both excited and deeply uneasy. He didn't get into fights. He didn't vape behind the gym. He was polite in a way that felt like a transaction, a necessary step to get people to leave him alone. But we get to see behind the glass. We get to go inside. Imagine his room. It wasn't messy with video game posters and dirty clothes. It was sterile. A controlled environment. Every book on the shelf was arranged by subject and then by height. The desk was a vast, empty plane of black glass, holding only a single powerful laptop. There were no personal photos. No mementos. The only hint of something beyond cold calculation was a single, framed quote on the wall from a philosopher. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Leo had circled the last sentence in black ink. This wasn't a bedroom, it was a command center. And in the center of it all was Leo. He wasn't socially awkward. That's a misunderstanding. Awkwardness implies a desire to connect, but a failure to do so. Leo felt no such desire. He saw his peers not as friends or rivals, but as variables in a slow, tedious equation. Their emotions were illogical glitches. Their conversations were a predictable exchange of social scripts. He found it all boring. His parents. They were proud, of course. They saw his straight A's, his trophies from science fairs. They never actually saw him enjoy. They saw the result, not the engine. And the engine inside Leo was cold, humming with a profound and unshakable belief in his own superiority. He didn't just think he was smarter than everyone else. He believed he was operating on a fundamentally higher plane of existence. He kept a journal, encrypted, on a server no one knew about. He didn't write about his feelings. He wrote his observations. His theories. One entry, written a year before Benji died, read, "Emotion is a design flaw in the human operating system. It clouds judgment, prioritizes irrational connections over logical outcomes, and is the primary cause of human suffering. To be free is to be free from sentiment." He was, in his own mind, a god in training. A brilliant, beautiful, and utterly empty vessel. He looked at the world of Crestmere Bluffs and saw a system to be mastered. And he looked at the people in it, like Benji Caldwell, and saw nothing more than moving parts. Some parts were more useful than others. And some were simply flaws in the design that needed to be removed for the system to improve. This was the architecture of Leo Thorne's mind. A magnificent, imposing structure built on a foundation of pure ice. And as any engineer will tell you, the most dangerous flaw isn't a visible crack in the wall. It's a fundamental miscalculation in the foundation itself. For Leo, that miscalculation was his absolute, unshakable belief that he was the only real player in the game. He was about to learn that he was very, very wrong. Now, to understand the explosion, you have to meet the other half of the equation. The sun to Leo's ice. His name was Benji Caldwell. And if Leo was a sharp, cold piece of glass, Benji was warmth. The kind of kid who seemed to absorb sunlight and radiate it back out. He was 16, with the kind of easy, genuine smile that made you smile back without thinking about it. He wasn't a genius, not in Leo's way. He got B's and the occasional C. But he was smart where it counts, with people. His family's house, just 3 down from Leo's, was the opposite of the Thorne residence. It was constantly, beautifully messy. The Caldwell home always had a bike leaning against the garage door, a soccer ball on the flower bed, and the smell of something. Cookies, grilled cheese, spaghetti, drifting from the kitchen. The doors were often unlocked, not out of negligence, but because people were always coming and going. Benji was the center of that gravity. He was the kid who remembered your name. He'd ask the lunch lady how her dog was doing after it had surgery. He was the one who would, without a second thought, give the kid who forgot his gym clothes his own extra sweatshirt. It was effortless. It was innate. He was popular, sure. But not in the dramatic, movie star way. He was popular like a favorite local park is popular. A natural, welcoming place everyone just ends up at. And this goodness, is what Leo Thorne couldn't process. From Leo's perspective, Benji's life was a monument to unearned reward. Benji hadn't engineered his social status. He hadn't calculated his likability. It was just who he was. He had inherited his friends, his family's love, his easy place in the world, the same way he'd inherited his father's blue eyes and his mother's laugh. To Leo, Benji was a paradox. A creature who achieved maximum social success with what Leo saw as minimum intellectual effort. He was a king who didn't even know he was ruling a kingdom. And that, more than any specific insult, was the unforgivable thing. Benji Caldwell wasn't a saint. He was just a good kid. And in the perfectly ordered cold universe Leo was building in his mind, a good kid was an illogical variable. A sentimental flaw in the system. And for a mind like Leo's, a flaw isn't just something to be noted. It's something to be corrected. How does it happen? How does quiet disdain curdle into something actionable? For a mind like Leo's, it always comes down to a data point. A single, irrefutable piece of evidence that confirms his theory. And for Leo, that evidence arrived on a Tuesday, third period, in Mr. Davison's chemistry lab. The air in the room was always thick with the smell of ammonia and anxiety. That day, the class was working on a complex titration experiment. It's a delicate process. You have to add one solution to another, drop by drop, until it just barely changes color. One drop too many, and you've overshot it. It requires a steady hand and a patient mind. Leo, of course, had prepared. He'd calculated the probable endpoint. His movements were precise, robotic. His station was a picture of efficiency. He was nearing his calculated finish line, his beaker showing the first hint of the required pale pink. And then, from the station next to him, came a laugh. Benji's laugh. Leo glanced over. Benji's station was a minor disaster, a spilled powder, a crumpled paper towel, his lab partner looking confused. But Benji himself was grinning, completely unbothered. He wasn't following the precise instructions. He was just playing. Adding a drop, swirling the flask, chatting with his partner about the basketball game last night. And then, impossibly, as Leo watched, Benji's solution shifted to a perfect, flawless pale pink. A full 30 seconds before Leo's. Mr. Davison walked over, peered into Benji's beaker, and clapped him on the shoulder. Excellent work, Benjamin. Intuitive grasp of the process. Intuitive. That was the word that did it. That was the data point. Leo looked down at his own, now completed experiment, his victory ash in his mouth. He had done everything right. He had followed the logic. He had earned his result. Benji had just stumbled into it. He had achieved the correct outcome through chaos, through luck, through some unquantifiable feel. And the system, the teacher, the universe, had rewarded him for it. It was, in that sterile, smelly lab, the ultimate proof of everything Leo believed. The world wasn't fair. It didn't reward the most logical. It rewarded the most charming. It was a system broken at its core. And as Benji laughed again, wiping his hands on his jeans, he had no idea he'd just become more than an annoyance to the boy next to him. He'd become a symbol. A variable that had returned an erroneous result. And in Leo Thorne's world, erroneous results aren't just noted. They are deleted. The decision was made. It wasn't a decision born of hot rage, the kind that makes you smash a fist through a wall. No, this was colder. It was the click of a key turning in a lock. The variable had been identified, and the necessary correction was now clear. For Leo, this was just the next logical step in his personal project of mastering a flawed world. And what does a master do? He plans. Meticulously. Let's pull up the files from that encrypted journal. Let's look at the blueprint. First, the motive. Or, more accurately, the absence of one. Leo knew that connection is the first thing detectives look for. A thread between the killer and the victim. So, he began to systematically sever every possible thread in advance. He stopped any interaction with Benji. No more glances, no more passive-aggressive comments in class. He became a ghost in Benji's life. If anyone looked back, there would be nothing to see. No argument, no rivalry, no unrequited crush. Just empty space. Next, the method. It couldn't be a shooting. Too loud, too messy, too much collateral damage. It couldn't be a knife from his own kitchen, traceable. It had to be something clean. Something that could be found and then discarded without a second thought. He settled on a simple, heavy object. Something blunt. The kind of thing that could be any kid's backpack weight, or a tool from any garage. He even noted in his journal, the instrument must be mundane. Its commonness is its invisibility. Then, the location. This was the masterstroke. He wouldn't lure Benji to some remote, suspicious spot. He would go to Benji. And he knew exactly where. The Caldwell house. Specifically, the Caldwell's new, state-of-the-art home cinema in the basement. Benji spent hours down there, playing video games, the sound cranked up, the room soundproofed. A perfect, isolated bubble. But how to get in? This is where Leo's patience paid off. For weeks, he'd been casually noting the habits of the Caldwell family. He knew that on Tuesday afternoons, Benji's mother had her long yoga class and then grocery shopped. His father worked late. The house was empty for a 3-hour window. Except for Benji, who always came straight home on Tuesdays to game before dinner. Leo also knew, from a casual conversation he'd overheard months before, that the Caldwells kept a spare key under a specific, fake rock in the garden. A rock he had identified and verified. He didn't need to break a window or pick a lock. He could just walk in. Like a ghost. Finally, the alibi. While the act was happening, he needed to be seen elsewhere. So, he created a digital footprint. He scheduled an online gaming session with a player in another country for that exact time, a session that would log his username and show activity. He also planned to be seen at the public library, leaving just before the time of the crime, and returning just after. He would use the library's computers for a few minutes, ensuring a time-stamped login. He was creating a digital puppet that would dance on screen while the real Leo was elsewhere. He wrote in his journal, the night before, "The perfect crime is not one that is never discovered. It is one that, when discovered, leads to a dead end. They will know a crime occurred. But they will never be able to build a bridge from the act to me. The absence of motive is my shield. The commonness of the tool is my cloak. And the predictability of their emotions is my key." He closed the laptop. He looked around his sterile, ordered room. He felt no fear. No dread. Only the quiet, humming satisfaction of a complex problem solved. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer. He was an artist. And the canvas was about to be painted. The Tuesday arrived. It was a day so ordinary it was almost mocking. The sun was out. The sprinklers in Crestmere Bluffs did their synchronized dance. And Leo Thorne went to school. He answered a question about the Krebs cycle in biology. He ate a turkey sandwich at lunch, alone. He was a ghost, preparing to become a phantom. After school, he did exactly what his blueprint dictated. He went to the public library. He logged into a computer, did a cursory search for a physics paper, creating a digital timestamp. He waved to the librarian on his way out. A perfect, visible alibi. Then, he walked. Not with a hurried, guilty pace, but with the calm, deliberate stride of a man going to a business meeting. He cut through backyards, using the lush, manicured hedges as cover. He arrived at the edge of the Caldwell property. The house was silent, just as he knew it would be. He found the fake rock. It was lighter than it looked. The key was cold in his hand. This was the moment of maximum risk. But his hand was steady. The lock turned with a soft, oiled click. He was in. The house smelled of lemon polish and the faint, sweet scent of the Caldwell's laundry detergent. He could hear the deep, thrumming bass of video game explosions coming from the basement. Perfect. He moved through the pristine living room, a shadow in a museum of domestic life. A family photo on the wall showed Benji, laughing, his arms around his parents. Leo looked at it with the dispassionate interest of a geologist studying a rock formation. He didn't go straight down. First, he went to the garage. It was tidy, organized. On a workbench, among the tools, was a heavy, solid rubber paperweight from a local insurance company. It was unremarkable. Mundane. Exactly what he'd planned for. He picked it up. It felt dense, final, in his hand. Then, and only then, did he descend the stairs to the basement. The home cinema was a cavern of sound and flickering light. On the massive screen, a war game was playing, pixels of fire and smoke blooming silently. The only sound was the game's audio, the roar of engines, the chatter of gunfire, the frantic voice of a teammate in Benji's headset. Benji was slumped in a giant recliner, his back to the door, completely absorbed. He had no idea. He was wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. One sock had a hole in the heel. Leo stood there for a full 10 seconds, watching him. He wasn't feeling hatred. He wasn't feeling anything at all. This was just the final step in the procedure. The deletion of a flawed data point. He crossed the plush carpet in 3 silent steps. Benji must have sensed a shift in the air, a shadow falling over him. He started to turn, his head beginning to swivel, the headset starting to slip. He never made it. Leo brought the paperweight down once. It wasn't a wild, angry swing. It was a precise, clinical motion. A termination. There was a terrible, dull sound, like a melon being dropped on a wet floor. The headset flew off, and a tinny voice from the game could be heard asking, "Benji? You there, man? You just went offline." But Benji was already gone. Slumped forward, a dark, spreading stain marring the perfect gray fabric of the chair. Leo didn't pause. He didn't check for a pulse. The outcome was certain. He carefully wiped the paperweight clean with the bottom of his shirt and placed it on the floor next to the chair, making it look like it had fallen from a shelf during a struggle, a pointless misdirection, but part of the script. He turned and walked back up the stairs, his breathing even. He left the house, locked the door behind him, and placed the key back under the rock. He walked back through the perfect yards, a ghost returning to the world of the living. He went back to the library, logged into another computer, and stayed for exactly 22 minutes. He had done it. He had executed the perfect, motiveless crime. He was untouchable. And as he sat in the sterile silence of the library, the only thing he felt was the clean, satisfying click of a problem solved. He had no way of knowing that the first domino had already fallen. That he hadn't just killed a boy. He had unleashed something far, far worse than the justice he so cleverly evaded. The beautiful, silent machine of Crestmere Bluffs kept running for a little while longer. The sprinklers ticked on at 4:30 p.m. The silent electric cars began to glide back into driveways. The setting sun painted the white houses in warm, golden hues, a perfect picture of an ordinary Tuesday evening. It was Mrs. Caldwell who found him. She came home, her arms laden with grocery bags filled with organic kale and free-range chicken, the ingredients for a healthy family dinner. She pushed the door open with her hip, calling out, "Benji, I need help with these bags." The new VR headset came, "It's on the counter." Silence. That was the first wrong note. The bass from the basement, which was usually a constant, thrumming heartbeat in the house, was absent. The only sound was the gentle hum of the refrigerator. "Benji, don't make me come down there." A joke. A familiar, maternal refrain. She put the bags on the kitchen island, her keys clattering too loudly in the quiet. Maybe he'd fallen asleep. Maybe he'd gone to a friend's and forgotten to text. Annoyance began to prick at her. A familiar, mundane irritation. She walked to the top of the basement stairs. The door was ajar. "Benjamin Caldwell, if you're ignoring me." The words died in her throat halfway down the steps. The air in the basement was still and cool. The giant screen was frozen on a game over menu, casting a dull, gray light over the room. And in that eerie, silent glow, she saw the shape of her son. Slumped in the chair. Not moving. Her mind, in that first second, tried to file it under something normal. He's asleep. He's sick. But then her eyes, refusing to be fooled, registered the dark, ugly stain on the headrest. The unnatural angle of his head. The terrible, final stillness of it. A sound escaped her. Not a scream, but a short, sharp gasp, like all the air had been punched from her lungs. The world shrank to the size of that room, to that chair, to that impossible sight. Her legs gave way, and she crumpled onto the carpet, her hand flying to her mouth. The 911 call was a masterpiece of broken horror. Dispatchers are trained for chaos, for screams. But it was the choked, whispering disbelief in Helen Caldwell's voice that was truly chilling. "My son. There's blood. He's not moving, please." The first police car arrived in under 3 minutes, sirens slicing through the evening calm. Then another. And another. The beautiful, silent street began to fill with the alien sounds of officialdom, crackling radios, slamming doors, the low, serious murmur of voices. Neighbors emerged onto their porches, their faces masks of concern and a dark, thrilling curiosity. They saw the paramedics go in, their equipment in hand. And they saw them come out minutes later, their faces grim, their gear unused. There was nothing for them to do. The perfect green lawn of the Caldwell house was now being trampled by heavy, pragmatic boots. The pristine facade of Crestmere Bluffs was cracked open, and the darkness that had been festering underneath was now out in the open, breathing the same clean, expensive air as everyone else. And across the street, Watching from his perfectly clean window was Leo Thorne. He observed the flashing lights, the gathering crowd, with the detached interest of a scientist watching the results of an experiment. It was going exactly to plan. But he missed one detail. He was so focused on the chaos, he didn't see Arthur Caldwell, Benji's father, arrive home. He didn't see the man stand on his own perfect walkway, a briefcase in his hand, as a uniformed officer stepped in front of him and started speaking in a low, careful tone. Leo didn't see the exact moment Arthur's entire world collapsed. The moment his knees buckled. The moment he didn't cry out, but simply folded. Because while Leo understood the theory of grief, he had no concept of its practical, terrifying weight. And he had no idea that in breaking Arthur Caldwell's heart, he had just created his most dangerous and unpredictable enemy. And so, the machine of justice, clunky, slow, but relentless, grinds into motion. The one they send in is Detective Eva Morales. You'd like her. She's in her late 40s, with a tired face that's seen every flavor of human deceit, and a coffee thermos that's her constant companion. She doesn't live in Crestmere Bluffs. She lives in the real world, where things smell like takeout and car exhaust. She steps into the Caldwell house, and the first thing she notices is the dissonance. The screaming silence of grief coming from the living room, where Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell are being comforted. And the sterile, violent reality of the basement crime scene. Her team is already there, a swarm of people in booties and gloves, taking pictures, measuring, dusting for prints. The room is a mess of potential evidence, but it's all wrong. She stands over the chair. She looks at Benji. She doesn't see a victim yet, she sees a puzzle. The wound is blunt force trauma. Simple, brutal, efficient. The weapon, a stupid paperweight, is right there on the floor. It's been wiped clean. And that's the first red flag. A crime of passion? Usually messy. A robbery gone wrong? Things are stolen, drawers are pulled out. But this feels staged. Neat. The location is a soundproof room, which is smart. The murder weapon is common, untraceable, which is smarter. But leaving it there, wiped clean? That feels like someone trying to look like they're being messy, when they're actually being very, very careful. She turns to her sergeant. What do we have? No sign of forced entry. Front door was locked. Family says a spare key is kept under a fake rock in the garden. And it's still there. Morales's eyebrows go up. So either the kid let his killer in, the killer had a key, or the killer knew about the spare and was polite enough to put it back. Nothing adds up. They can't find a motive. Benji Caldwell was, by all accounts, a sunbeam. No enemies. No drug habits. No secret, toxic relationships. He was just a kid who ended up dead in a soundproof room. The local cops are already whispering about a random, transient intruder, a monster who wandered in from the outside. It's the easy answer. The comfortable one. It means the beautiful cage of Crestmere Bluffs is still secure, just unlucky. But Morales isn't buying it. This doesn't feel random. Random is chaotic. This was clinical. This was a procedure. She feels the shape of the killer's mind in the emptiness of the clues. The absence of a motive isn't an absence. It's a presence. It's the loudest clue in the room. She sips her coffee, looking around the perfect basement in the perfect house on the perfect street. And she knows, deep in her gut, the monster they're looking for didn't wander in from the outside. He was already here. He's been here all along. And he's sitting somewhere close by, right now, watching them scramble. He's part of the scenery. And that makes him infinitely more dangerous than any stranger. Now, watch this. This is where Leo Thorne truly believed he cemented his masterpiece. 2 days after the murder, Detective Morales decided to do the rounds at the high school. A formality, really. Talking to teachers, coaches, and a few of Benji's classmates. She set up in a small, sterile conference room that usually smelled of old microwave popcorn. And one by one, the kids came in. Most were shaken. Tears were common. Voices trembled. It was raw, real grief. Then came Leo. He walked in with a quiet, respectful posture. He didn't slouch. He didn't fidget. He sat down, placed his hands flat on the table, and looked at Detective Morales with an expression of polite attentiveness. Just a hint of sadness around the eyes. The perfect portrait of a concerned citizen. Leo, Morales began, her voice neutral. I know this is difficult. Can you tell me about Benji? What was your relationship like? And Leo, He was brilliant. He didn't trash Benji. He didn't pretend to be his best friend. That would be too obvious. Instead, he painted a picture of benign, casual acquaintance. Benji was really popular, he said, his tone thoughtful, almost admiring. Everyone liked him. We didn't really run in the same circles. I'm more into academics. He was more social. But he was always nice. I never saw him be mean to anyone. Do you see what he did there? He gave the absolute, unvarnished truth, but framed it in a way that was completely harmless. He created a chasm between them, the brain and the social butterfly, that was so wide, so logical, no one would ever think to build a bridge across it. Morales watched him closely. Where were you on Tuesday between 4 o'clock and 5 p.m.? The public library, Leo said without a hint of hesitation. I had to research a paper on quantum entanglement. I was there from about 3:45 until just after 5 o'clock. I saw Mrs. Gable, the librarian, when I left. It was all true. Every word. The library's digital logs would confirm it. His username was active in an online game. He was a ghost with a perfect, verifiable alibi. He was so calm. So precise. There was no sweat on his brow, no nervous glance away. He was answering questions, not defending himself. Because in his mind, there was nothing to defend. He had built an impregnable fortress of facts. When he left the room, he even gave Morales a small, somber nod. I hope you find who did this. The door clicked shut. Morales sat back in her chair, sipping her cold coffee. The kid was polished. Too polished. Most honest people are a mess of emotions and half-remembered details during an interview. They're human. Leo Thorne hadn't seemed human. He'd seemed scripted. But a feeling isn't evidence. And everything he'd said checked out. He was, by all measurable metrics, in the clear. As Leo walked back to class, he felt the warm glow of victory. He had looked the system in the eye and he had won. He had no idea that his performance, his perfect, emotionless control, was the very thing that had just painted a tiny red target on his back. He hadn't convinced Detective Morales he was innocent. He had convinced her he was fascinating. And in her line of work, fascinating is the most dangerous thing you can be. While the police were chasing leads and interviewing teenagers, something else was stirring in the Caldwell house. Something quiet. Something far more dangerous than grief. I need you to meet Arthur Caldwell, Benji's father. In the days after the murder, he was a statue. Where his wife, Helen, was a raw, open wound, sobbing, crumbling, sedated, Arthur was still. He moved through their beautiful, broken house with a slow, deliberate grace. He accepted the casseroles from neighbors with a quiet, thank you. He shook the hands of the detectives, his grip firm, his eyes dry. To everyone else, it looked like strength. The Rock. The stoic father holding his family together. But we get to see the machinery inside. Arthur wasn't a businessman or a salesman. He was an architect. And not the kind who just draws pretty houses. He designed complex, modern structures, museums, libraries, buildings that were all about load-bearing forces and hidden tensions. His mind didn't deal in emotions. It dealt in blueprints. In cause and effect. In the unshakable truth that if a support beam fails, the entire structure comes down. And his son was gone. The central support beam of his life had been violently, intentionally kicked out. So, while Helen grieved, Arthur began to analyze. He sat for hours in Benji's room, not weeping over his childhood toys, but observing. He was looking for the fracture point, the flaw in the design. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that this was not random. This was not some stranger. This was personal. It had to be. Because a random stranger would have stolen something. A random stranger wouldn't have known about the spare key. A random stranger wouldn't have felt the need to wipe the weapon clean. One night, he stood in the doorway of the basement, looking down into the darkness. The police had taken the chair, the paperweight, everything. The room was just an empty, silent space now. But Arthur wasn't seeing the emptiness. He was running a simulation in his mind. He thought, the killer entered here. He knew the schedule. He knew the key was under the rock. He knew Benji would be in the soundproof room. He chose a weapon of opportunity from my own garage. This wasn't an invasion. This was a renovation. Someone decided my son was a structural flaw in their world, and they removed him. The thought was so cold, so horrifying that it should have broken him. But for Arthur, it was a revelation. It was a new set of architectural plans. The plans for a murder. He walked to his home office, a room of clean lines and severe order, much like Leo's. He opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, he didn't write a word. He drew a diagram, a timeline, a map of his own house, with arrows indicating entry, path, and exit. The police were looking for a monster from the outside. Detective Morales was looking for a motive. But Arthur Caldwell was now looking for an engineer. A cold, brilliant mind that saw his family as a set of variables. And as he stared at that diagram, a name floated into his consciousness. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, dreadful click. The quiet boy. The prodigy. The one who looked at the world as if it were a math problem he was bored of solving. Leo Thorne. It was just a hypothesis. A theory. But for an architect, a theory is everything. It's the foundation you build upon. And Arthur Caldwell had just laid the first silent stone of a foundation that would be Leo's undoing. The hunter had no idea he was now being hunted. Arthur's investigation began not with a suspect, but with a list. A timeline of that Tuesday, meticulously reconstructed. He sat at his desk, the police report, what little of it they'd shared, spread out before him like a schematic. He was looking for a discrepancy. A single, loose thread. And he found it in the most mundane place imaginable, the garage. The police report listed the murder weapon as a solid rubber paperweight, approximate 5 pounds, from Caldwell residence. It was a detail that had been kept out of the news. A crucial piece of the puzzle that only the killer and the investigators would know. Arthur stood in his garage, his eyes scanning the workbench. The spot where the paperweight had been was now just a faint, clean circle in a thin layer of dust. His mind, trained to see patterns and disruptions, replayed the detective's interview with him and Helen. Detective Morales had asked, "Does anything look out of place? Missing?" And Arthur, numb, had said no. But now, he remembered something else. Something Leo Thorne had said. During his own interview with Morales, which Arthur had later politely requested the notes for, Leo was asked if he'd ever been in the Caldwell house. Leo's answer was perfectly crafted, only a few times, for group projects. "We always worked in the kitchen. I've never even seen the basement." It was a solid, believable alibi for his presence in the house. But then, Arthur's eyes locked on the dust-free circle on the bench. The paperweight. It had been a freebie from a local insurance company. It was ugly and utilitarian. Arthur had kept it on his desk downtown for years, but had brought it home just a few weeks ago to use as a doorstop in the garage. It had never been in the main house. Not once. So how did Leo Thorne, a boy who claimed he'd only ever been in the kitchen, know to select a weapon from the garage? He wouldn't. He couldn't. Unless. The air left Arthur's lungs. It wasn't a shout of triumph. It was the silent, chilling click of a final piece sliding into a terrible puzzle. This wasn't proof you could take to a court of law. It was a hairline fracture in the flawless marble facade of Leo's story. But for an architect, a hairline fracture is where you focus all your attention. Because that's where the entire structure is most vulnerable. While Arthur Caldwell was building his case in silence, another thread was beginning to unravel. This one started in classroom 214, with a woman who spent her life deciphering the human mind. Ms. Green taught advanced placement psychology. She was a sharp, intuitive woman in her 30s who believed that her subject wasn't just in a textbook, but was playing out in the halls of the school every single day. And in the weeks following Benji's death, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Leo Thorne. It wasn't anything he did. It was what he didn't do. The school was a mausoleum of grief. Kids were hugging in the hallways, breaking down in class, sharing memories. The emotional atmosphere was thick, palpable. Everyone was processing the shock, the horror, the sadness. Everyone except Leo. He moved through the halls with the same detached, analytical calm as always. He offered no condolences. He shared no memories. He didn't seem uncomfortable with the emotion around him. He seemed oblivious to it. As if it were background noise, a statistical anomaly not worth his processing power. This prickled at Ms. Green's professional curiosity. Then, she remembered something. She went back into her files, to a digital folder of essays from the previous semester. The assignment had been, analyze a historical figure through the lens of a psychological concept of your choice. She found Leo's paper. The title made her blood run cold, The Unreasonable Man, a study of narcissistic personality disorder in revolutionary figures. She opened it. The writing was brilliant, of course. Flawless logic, perfect grammar. But the content? It was a clinical dissection of figures who believed the rules of society didn't apply to them. It wasn't a condemnation. It was a justification. He argued that their perceived disorder was, in fact, a necessary evolutionary adaptation for progress. That their inability to feel empathy was not a weakness, but a strategic advantage, allowing them to make decisions unfettered by sentiment. He had written, "Empathy is a tool for social cohesion, but it is a liability for true, world-altering innovation. The greatest leaps in human history were made by those who saw people not as feeling beings, but as variables in a greater equation." At the time, she'd given him an A-. She'd written in the margin, "A compelling, if chilling, argument. Be careful not to confuse intellectual reasoning with moral justification." Now, sitting in her quiet, empty classroom, those words echoed in her mind. This wasn't just an academic exercise for him. It was a manifesto, a blueprint for a way of thinking. She thought about going to Detective Morales. But what would she say? "I have a student who wrote a really smart, really cold essay." It wasn't evidence. It was a feeling. A teacher's intuition. But she couldn't let it go. She watched him in class, his calm, superior demeanor, and she saw the living embodiment of that paper. He wasn't grieving because, in his worldview, grief was an illogical response to a corrected variable. She didn't have a smoking gun. All she had was a key that fit a lock she was terrified to open. So she held onto it, this tiny, heavy piece of the puzzle, waiting for the moment it might be needed. Unknowingly, she had just become another silent witness in Arthur Caldwell's shadow trial. Arthur Caldwell was no longer a grieving father. He was a project manager, and the project was the unmasking of a killer. He had his hypothesis, Leo Thorne. He had his first piece of circumstantial evidence, the paperweight from the garage. But he needed more. He needed to understand the mind, and to do that, he needed to get inside its digital fortress. He started with what he knew. Leo was a prodigy. Arrogant. He saw the world as a system to be hacked. A boy like that, he wouldn't just think these things. He would document them. It would be a part of his pathology. To create something so perfect and not record it for his own admiration would be unthinkable. It would be like an architect designing a masterpiece and then burning the blueprints. But where? It wouldn't be on a public social media profile. It would be hidden. Encrypted. Arthur began his own digital shadowing. He started with the school's public-facing systems, the debate team forum, the coding club's message board. He saw Leo's username, Axiom. A statement or proposition that is regarded as being established, accepted, or self-evidently true. Of course. He noticed Leo's posts were always perfectly logical, but often ended with a kind of philosophical taunt. In a debate about ethics, he'd written, "Laws are a constraint on the unreasonable man. For the reasonable man, they are unnecessary." It was all there, in plain sight, disguised as intellectual discourse. Then, Arthur had a darker thought. The library. Leo's alibi was the public library. What if he wasn't just using it as a cover? What if he was using their network, their public computers, as a secure terminal? A place no one would think to connect to him. So, Arthur went to the library. He didn't skulk around. He walked right up to Mrs. Gable, the librarian who'd verified Leo's presence. He introduced himself as Benji's father, working on a memorial scholarship. He asked if he could see the computer logs for that Tuesday, saying he was trying to piece together his son's final day and wanted to see if Benji had been there too. It was a lie, but a compassionate one, and Mrs. Gable, her eyes full of pity, agreed. The logs showed Leo's user session. He had indeed been logged in. But Arthur, an architect who understood complex systems, looked past the simple login. He saw that the computer Leo used was an ancient, dusty machine in the far corner. The one with the sticky K key. The one most people avoided. And then he saw it. In the network activity logs, which Mrs. Gable didn't understand but allowed him to see, there was a brief, encrypted data transfer from that specific computer to an external IP address right at 4:15 p.m., the heart of the murder window. It lasted less than 30 seconds. A simple ping. A check-in. It was a heartbeat. The digital ghost of Leo Thorne, proving he was alive and online while his physical body was elsewhere, committing murder. He wasn't just using the library for an alibi. He was using it as a relay. A command post. Arthur didn't celebrate. He took a picture of the log with his phone. His hand was steady. He now had a second thread. The first was the physical clue of the paperweight. The second was this digital ghost. Both pointed to a mind of meticulous, arrogant calculation. He walked out of the library into the afternoon sun. He had no proof that could convict. But he had a profile. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that the killer had left a journal. A digital trophy of his own genius. And Arthur would find it. He would mirror the killer's own methods. Patient, precise, and utterly without mercy. The hunt was officially on. Arthur was now a ghost in the machine, hunting another ghost. He knew Leo's arrogance was the key. A boy that smart, that convinced of his own superiority, wouldn't just keep a journal. He'd want to admire it. He'd need to access it, to reread his own genius. He wouldn't keep it on a single, encrypted drive in his bedroom. He'd keep it in the cloud, somewhere he could reach it from anywhere. A secret vault only he held the key to. Arthur's architectural mind understood structures. And every structure, no matter how secure, has a blueprint. A plan. You just have to find it. He started with the obvious. He created a fake social media profile, a fellow young prodigy from another state, interested in the same obscure philosophers Leo quoted. He sent Leo a friend request. It was accepted within an hour. Leo's vanity, his need for an audience, was a gap in his firewall. Arthur spent days studying Leo's posts, his likes, his comments. It was all a performance, but even performances have behind-the-scenes details. In the comments of a tech article, he saw Leo argue with another user. And in a moment of arrogant frustration, Leo typed a sentence that made Arthur's breath catch. A truly secure system doesn't rely on password complexity. It relies on obscurity. A secret only the architect knows. The architect. The word was a key turning in a lock. Arthur's mind raced. What was the most obscure, hidden thing about Leo? What secret would he use? Not his mother's maiden name. Not his pet's name. He would use something that proved his intellectual dominance. A secret only he knew. And then Arthur remembered the quote on Leo's bedroom wall, the one from the police crime scene photos. The one by the philosopher, therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Leo had circled the last sentence. The unreasonable man. What if that wasn't just a motto? What if it was a password? A passphrase? He had to get a sample of Leo's online habits, a footprint. Using the school's public Wi-Fi, a neutral, untraceable location, Arthur used a sophisticated data scraping tool he'd learned about in his own work for securing blueprints. He targeted Leo's public Axiom profiles. He wasn't hacking, not yet. He was mapping. And the map led to a single encrypted cloud storage service, the kind favored by privacy extremists and criminals. The username wasn't Axiom. It was the Unreasonable Man. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The vault. Now came the moment of truth. The illegal part. The part that would make any evidence he found worthless in court. He didn't care about courts anymore. He cared about truth. Using a complex algorithm, he began running a brute force attack, but not with random characters. He fed it variations of the quote, of Leo's personal philosophies, of the names of the philosophers he admired. 4 hours. Nothing. The system rejected every attempt. Then, almost as a final, desperate guess, he typed the entire circled sentence, but as Leo would have written it. Not as a statement, but as a declaration of identity. I am the Unreasonable Man. The screen blinked. A green checkmark appeared. He was in. The vault was not what he expected. There were no folders labeled Murder or Benji. There were spreadsheets, timelines, diagrams of the Caldwell house, more accurate than the ones the police had drawn. There were files on his classmates, rated by their intelligence and social utility. It was a chilling, dispassionate catalog of a human ecosystem. And then he found the journal. He opened the most recent entry, dated the night of the murder. The words were not the ravings of a madman. They were the clinical notes of a scientist. He described the procedure with detached precision. The sound Benji's head made was noted as an acceptable auditory confirmation of structural failure. He expressed no remorse, only a quiet satisfaction at the successful correction of a systemic anomaly. He concluded with, "The experiment is a success. The emotional responses of the other variables, parents, police, are predictable and illogical. I remain the only constant. The only real mind in a world of faulty software." Arthur sat back in his chair, the words burning into his mind. He felt no triumph, only a cold, vast horror. He was not reading the confession of an angry boy. He was reading the mission log of a predator who saw his son as a bug in the code. He had the truth. It was uglier than he had ever imagined. And it was locked in his hands, completely useless in a court of law. He was now the keeper of a terrible secret, and the only one who knew the true depth of the monster living 3 houses down. The game had just changed entirely. Arthur Caldwell now held the absolute, terrifying truth in his hands. He had Leo's confession. But it was a truth he had stolen, a key turned illegally in a lock. If he took this to Detective Morales, it would be thrown out of court. Leo's slick lawyer would have a field day, and the only thing that would be punished is Arthur for hacking. No, the law was a cage, and Leo had already proven he could pick its lock. So Arthur made a decision. He would not use the journal to convict Leo. He would use it as a blueprint. He would use Leo's own arrogance, his fatal flaw, as the weapon. He sat in his silent office, the digital journal open on one screen, a blank document on the other. He wasn't a father seeking justice anymore. He was an architect designing a collapse. And every collapse starts with targeting the main support beam. He began to write. Not as Arthur Caldwell, but as a persona he called Veritas, Latin for truth. He created a new, encrypted email address, its digital footprint routed through the same obscure servers Leo used. He studied the journal's language, its cold, superior tone. He learned to mimic it. Then, he sent a single email to Leo's secret Axiom account. The subject line was, "A flaw in the equation." The body of the email was short, precise, and devastating. It read, "Your analysis of the procedure was admirably logical. However, your foundational premise is flawed. You operated on the assumption that you were the only real mind in a system of simple variables. This was your critical error. You failed to account for a constant you did not perceive. Your work is being observed. The system is self-correcting." He didn't accuse Leo of murder. He critiqued his work. He attacked his intellect. He hit send. Then, he sat back and waited. He wasn't waiting for a confession. He was waiting for a reaction. He had just thrown a stone into the perfectly still pond of Leo's mind. And he knew, with the certainty of a physicist, that the ripples would be visible. Across the street, in his sterile room, Leo Thorne received the notification. He read the email. And for the first time since he'd begun his project, a crack appeared in his calm. His heart didn't race with fear. It pulsed with something else, outrage. Incandescent, pure outrage. Someone was questioning his perfection. Someone dared to suggest he had made an error. He didn't write back. He was too smart for that. But he began to look. He scanned his digital fortress for breaches. He reread his own journal entries, searching for the flaw this Veritas had found. The trap was set. Arthur hadn't laid a physical trap with wires and alarms. He had laid a psychological one, baited with the one thing Leo could not tolerate, the implication that he was not the smartest person in the room. He had turned Leo's greatest strength, his intellect, into his greatest vulnerability. The hunter was now actively provoking the beast, leading it right where he wanted it to go. The final act was about to begin. The crack that Arthur created began to spread. Leo Thorne, the boy who never made mistakes, was suddenly making them. He was obsessed with Veritas. He started spending hours online, his focus shifting from maintaining his alibi to hunting his mysterious critic. He became paranoid, looking over his shoulder, his cool detachment replaced by a twitchy, simmering anger. Detective Morales saw the change. The once polished boy was now showing seams. He was abrupt in a follow-up interview, his answers clipped, his eyes darting. When she casually mentioned the Caldwell's garage in a question, she saw it, a flicker. A micro-expression of recognition and panic, quickly suppressed. The paperweight. He'd walked right into Arthur's trap. But Morales still had nothing solid. Then, Arthur Caldwell walked into her office. He didn't bring the journal. He didn't mention hacking. He came as a grieving father with a desperate theory. "Check his digital activity," Arthur said, his voice calm but firm. "Not just the library logs. Look for remote access. Look for a second device. A phone, a tablet, something he could have used to create that network ping from the library while he was somewhere else. He's too arrogant not to have checked in." It was the nudge she needed. Morales obtained a warrant for a deeper dive into Leo's online activity. And this time, they found it. The encrypted cloud storage account, the Unreasonable Man. They couldn't open it without the password, but they could see its existence. And they could see the metadata. The files had been accessed and modified on the day of the murder, and again just recently, from an IP address linked to the public library. The digital ghost became a tangible lead. They brought Leo in for one final interview. This time, the room felt different. Colder. Morales didn't ask him about Benji. She asked him about his philosophies. She quoted lines from his school essay, watching his face. She saw the shock, then the dawning fury that someone was in his intellectual space. And then she played her card. Leo, we're executing a warrant on your The Unreasonable Man cloud account right now. Our cyber team is cracking it as we speak. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about what we'll find in there? It was a bluff. They weren't in yet. But Leo didn't know that. He saw the certainty in her eyes. He saw the perfectly constructed walls of his fortress crumbling. The variable he hadn't accounted for, the persistence of a father, had broken his code. The arrogance that had built the crime now shattered in the face of its discovery. He didn't confess. He just shut down. The light in his eyes, the smug superiority, flickered and went out, replaced by a cold, empty stare. It was enough. Based on the garage discrepancy, the digital evidence of the cloud account, and his complete psychological collapse, they arrested him. The news spread through Crestmere Bluffs like a shockwave. The quiet prodigy. The murderer. The perfect image of the community was shattered, and the monster wasn't an outsider. He was one of their own. As Leo was led away in handcuffs, he looked not at the police, but across the street, at the Caldwell house. He saw Arthur Caldwell standing in the window, watching. Not smiling. Not crying. Just watching. And in that moment, Leo understood. He hadn't been beaten by the system. He'd been out-engineered. The trial wasn't the endgame. It was just the next phase of a war he now realized he was losing. The arrest was just the beginning. What followed was a media explosion that turned Crestmere Bluffs from a quiet sanctuary into a national spectacle. Satellite trucks parked on the pristine streets, their cables snaking across the manicured lawns like invasive vines. Reporters stood in front of the Thorne and Caldwell houses, their voices a low, constant murmur, turning a private tragedy into public consumption. Leo Thorne was no longer just a boy. He was a brand. The boy genius killer. News channels ran segments with titles like The Monster in Our Midst and The Making of a Psychopath. They dug up his old science fair trophies, interviewed stunned neighbors, and psychoanalyzed his straight-A report cards. He was a perfect, terrifying puzzle for the world to try and solve. And through it all, Leo adapted. He was in a juvenile detention center, but he was already preparing for his next stage. He saw the media not as a threat, but as a new, larger audience for his intellect. His court-appointed lawyer was a weary, overworked public defender, but the Thornes, desperate to believe their son was a victim of circumstance, mortgaged their beautiful home and hired a legal superstar. A slick, silver-haired lawyer named Julian Croft. Croft was a master of narrative. He didn't deal in facts, he dealt in stories. And the story he began to sell was a masterpiece. He went on every news show that would have him. He painted Leo as a fragile, profoundly gifted child, a victim of an overzealous system. He argued that the pressure of Crestmere Bluffs, the constant demand for perfection, had created a psychotic break. He never denied Benji's death was a tragedy, but he skillfully shifted the blame from Leo to the environment. A beautiful town, he'd say, his voice full of gravitas, can harbor beautiful, silent pressures that can crush a young mind. The most devastating part of his strategy? He began to carefully, subtly, imply that Arthur Caldwell was the real villain. He leaked the fact that Arthur was a trained architect with a mind for complex systems. He hinted that Arthur's grief had twisted into an obsession, that he had manufactured evidence to frame the town's awkward outsider because the police had no other leads. He painted Arthur not as a victim, but as a calculating, vengeful father who couldn't accept a random tragedy. The public, hungry for a simple story, split into two camps. One saw Leo as a cold-blooded monster. The other bought Croft's story hook, line, and sinker. They saw Leo as the tragic, misunderstood genius, and Arthur as the dangerous vigilante. Arthur would sit in his living room, the glow of the television painting his tired face, listening to a talking attorney tell the world that he was the monster. He didn't react. He didn't give interviews. He just watched, his jaw set. He knew this was part of the game now. A chess match played on a national stage. Leo, from his cell, watched the coverage too. He saw the debate, the division. He saw his new lawyer weaving a story that painted him as the hero of his own tragedy. And he felt his confidence returning. The system was just as malleable as he'd always believed. It was all just a game of manipulating variables. He was back in control. Or so he thought. He had no idea that his lawyer's brilliant strategy was inadvertently guiding him right toward the final, terrible justice Arthur had designed. The juvenile courtroom was nothing like the grand, wood-paneled halls you see in the movies. It was smaller, more functional, with cheap laminate tables and a pervasive smell of stale coffee and anxiety. But the stakes were every bit as high. The air was so thick with tension you could almost chew it. Every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall, notebooks ready. The Caldwell family sat on one side, a solid, somber block of black. Helen leaned into Arthur, who sat perfectly upright, his eyes fixed on the empty chair at the defense table. He was a monument. Then, a side door opened, and Leo Thorne walked in. He was wearing a simple too-large suit, chosen by his lawyer to make him look young, vulnerable. But he wore it like a costume. His hands were cuffed in front of him, but he held them calmly in his lap. His posture was relaxed. He didn't look at his parents, who were weeping quietly. He didn't look at the Caldwells. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the crowd, the cameras, the judge. He wasn't a defendant. He was an analyst, assessing his new laboratory. This was his stage. The prosecution went first. They laid out the facts. The timeline. The digital footprint. The paperweight from the garage. They painted a picture of a cold, premeditated murder. It was solid, logical, by the book. But then, it was the defense's turn. Julian Croft stood up, smooth as silk. He didn't attack the facts head-on. He started by talking about pressure. The unbearable, silent pressure of a town like Crestmere Bluffs. The pressure to be perfect, to be brilliant, to be the best. He painted Leo as a victim of this pressure. A boy with a mind so brilliant, so unique, that it simply broke. He called it a dissociative episode. He suggested that Leo, in a fugue state, might have gone to Benji's house, might have even been involved in the tragic accident, but he had no memory of it. The planning, the journal, the desperate, fictional creations of a mind trying to make sense of its own breakdown. He walked over to Leo and put a hand on his shoulder. Leo, on cue, looked up, his eyes wide, a convincing mask of confused innocence. "This isn't a killer," Croft said, his voice dropping to a heartfelt whisper. "This is a sick, traumatized child. A child who needs help, not a cage." And then, Croft did what he'd promised. He pivoted. He didn't name Arthur Caldwell, not directly. But he pointed a gleaming, rhetorical arrow straight at him. "We are expected to believe," he said, pacing slowly, "that a 15-year-old boy, under immense psychological strain, conceived and executed this perfect crime. Or is it possible that someone else, someone with a motive far more powerful than any a child could possess, saw an opportunity? Someone with a trained, architectural mind for detail? Someone drowning in grief, desperate for answers, and worse, desperate for a target." The implication hung in the air, toxic and unmistakable. The reporters scribbled furiously. A few people in the gallery actually turned to look at Arthur. And through it all, Leo sat there, the picture of wounded confusion. But if you looked closely, if you really watched his eyes, you could see it. A faint, cold light of satisfaction. He was enjoying the show. He was watching his lawyer reframe reality, and he was admiring the technique. He wasn't just playing a part, he was studying a master at work, learning for the next time he'd need to perform. He truly believed he was winning. He had no idea that his performance, his utter lack of genuine remorse, was being noted by the one person in the room whose opinion truly mattered, the judge. And he was completely oblivious to the final physical trap that was being laid, not with words, but with concrete and steel. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of logic, and now it was time to reinforce it with steel. They called their star witness to the stand, Dr. Isla Vance, a forensic psychologist and an expert in digital behavior. She was a woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor and a voice that could cut glass. Julian Croft had tried to paint Leo as a victim of a fugue state, a mind that broke under pressure. Dr. Vance was there to dismantle that fantasy, piece by piece. The prosecutor, a methodical man named Evans, didn't ask her about Leo's emotions. He asked her about his patterns. He had her walk the court through the digital journal, not as a diary, but as a blueprint. "Dr. Vance," Evans began, Based on your analysis of these documents, do they indicate a mind in a state of psychotic breakdown? Quite the opposite, she said, her voice clear and firm. They indicate a mind in a state of hyper-rational, deliberate planning. The language is consistently dispassionate and goal-oriented. There is an absence of the chaotic thought patterns, the emotional lability, or the perceptual distortions we associate with a dissociative episode. She pointed to specific entries. The timelines were precise. The diagrams of the Caldwell house were methodical. The profiles of his classmates were analytical, not paranoid. And this entry, dated the night of the murder, Evans said, displaying it on a screen for the court. He refers to the victim's death as a successful correction of a systemic anomaly. Does that sound like the language of a traumatized child? It does not, Dr. Vance replied, her gaze sweeping over the jury. It sounds like the language of an individual with a profound lack of empathy, who views other human beings as objects or obstacles. It is the language of a narcissistic personality, one who believes they are the sole arbiter of what is correct for their world. The defense objected, of course. Speculation. Croft barked, but the judge allowed it. This was an expert opinion, grounded in the evidence. Evans then guided her to the core of the defense's argument. Dr. Vance, the defense has suggested that these writings could be a fictional narrative, a coping mechanism created after a traumatic event. Is that consistent with what you see here? Dr. Vance almost smiled, a thin, clinical expression. No. The journal entries are proactive, not reactive. They detail planning and prediction. The entry written after the event does not express confusion or horror. It expresses satisfaction and a critique of the emotional responses of others. A mind fabricating a story to cope would likely create a narrative that paints themselves in a more sympathetic light, or that expresses confusion about the event. This journal does the exact opposite. It paints the author as a cold, logical god. And it does so consistently, over a long period of time. Her words hung in the air, stripping away the fancy lawyerly narrative and leaving the ugly, exposed girders of the truth. She wasn't just talking about a crime, she was conducting an autopsy on a personality. Leo kept his face neutral, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. He was being dissected, his brilliant mind laid out on a slide and examined under a microscope. This wasn't part of his script. They weren't arguing about what he did, they were arguing about what he was. And what Dr. Vance was describing was a monster. Not a broken boy, but a functional, calculating predator. The courtroom, for the first time, felt truly cold. The performance was over. The facts were speaking, and they were speaking in a voice of pure, terrifying ice. You had to give it to Julian Croft. The man was a master. He knew he couldn't win a war of facts against Dr. Vance's cold analysis. So he didn't try. Instead, he changed the battlefield. He stood up for his cross-examination, and he didn't look at the doctor. He turned and looked directly at the jury, making himself their guide, their confidant. Dr. Vance, he began, his voice smooth and reasonable. Your analysis is, as always, brilliant. The language in these journals is indeed cold. Dispassionate. It's the language of a mind that sees the world as a system. He paused, letting the jury agree with him. But isn't it true, he continued, that this system view of the world isn't exclusive to my client? That there are certain professions, certain trained minds, that are taught to think this way, to see people not as feeling beings, but as variables in a design. To see a house not as a home, but as a series of structural components and entry points. Dr. Vance frowned, sensing the trap. It's possible, but... For instance, Croft cut in, his voice gaining a sharp, precise edge. An architect. A highly skilled, highly trained architect, when designing a building, must be dispassionate. They must calculate load-bearing stresses. They must identify potential points of failure. They must plan for the most efficient routes of entry and exit. Is that correct? A slow, cold dread began to fill the room. Arthur Caldwell, in the front row, didn't move a muscle. Objection, relevance? The prosecutor called out, standing up. I'm establishing a pattern of thought, Your Honor, Croft said innocently. Overruled, the judge said, though she looked wary. Croft turned back to the witness. So, is it fair to say that an architect's mind is trained to be clinical? To think in blueprints and diagrams? In their professional capacity, yes, Dr. Vance conceded, tightly. Thank you, Doctor. No further questions. He sat down. He had never mentioned Arthur Caldwell by name. He didn't have to. The seed was planted. And in the next phase of his defense, he watered it. When it was his turn to present his case, Croft called a single, shocking witness, a private investigator he had hired. The man testified that he had reviewed the case files and found it highly unusual that a grieving father, Arthur Caldwell, had conducted such a detailed, parallel investigation. That he had theorized the murder weapon came from the garage before the police had confirmed it. That he had pressed the police to look at Leo Thorne specifically. Croft stood before the jury, his hands open, a picture of reason. We are not saying Mr. Caldwell killed his own son. The tragedy of that is unimaginable. But we are asking you to consider a different tragedy. The tragedy of a brilliant, grieving man, whose mind, trained for solving structural problems, could not accept a random, senseless act. A man who, in his desperate need for an answer, for a target, may have guided the evidence. May have seen a complex blueprint where there was only chaos. He was reframing Arthur's entire quest for justice as the real crime. He was painting Leo not as a killer, but as the victim of a sophisticated frame-up. And Leo? He sat there, the perfect picture of the wrong party. But inside, he was marveling at it. Croft was using the same tools he himself worshipped: logic, pattern recognition, systems thinking, and turning them into a weapon against his accuser. It was the most beautiful, twisted piece of programming he had ever seen. He was sure, in that moment, that he was going to walk away completely free. The system wasn't just malleable. It was his playground. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Leo sat beside his lawyer, his posture perfect, his expression one of mild, intellectual curiosity. He had already calculated the odds. The prosecution's case was circumstantial. The defense had sown powerful, reasonable doubt. He had won. The judge spoke, her voice echoing in the silence. On the count of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Helen Caldwell sobbed with relief. Arthur did not move. But then came the sentencing. Because of Leo's age, the guidelines were lenient. The judge listed the factors: his youth, his clean record, the defense's argument about environmental pressure. The sentence was handed down. 7 years. 7 years in a secure youth facility, with the possibility of parole in just a few. A slap on the wrist for a life taken. It was a victory disguised as a defeat. He had been found guilty, but the system had just confirmed his own sense of superiority. It couldn't truly touch him. It was a flawed, sentimental machine, and he had exploited its weakness. As the judge explained the terms, Leo's eyes met hers. And that's when it happened. The mask of the confused, traumatized boy finally, completely fell away. His lips twitched. Then they curved into a slow, unmistakable smirk. And from his throat came a soft puff of air, a quiet, condescending laugh. It wasn't loud, but in the stunned silence of the room, it was deafening. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. He had played the game, and even in losing this round, he believed he had won. He was laughing at the judge. He was laughing at the law. He was laughing at the Caldwell's pain. It was the most arrogant sound any of them had ever heard. And it was the final, critical piece of Arthur's design falling into place. Leo, in his moment of perceived triumph, had just sealed his true fate. The unthinkable was now inevitable. The laugh echoed, and then the courtroom erupted. Helen Caldwell let out a wounded cry. The judge slammed her gavel, her face a mask of fury. But Leo didn't care. As the bailiffs grabbed his arms to lead him away, he was still smirking. 7 years. He'd be out by 22. His intellect intact. His legend grown. It was a bargain. He was processed, put in a jumpsuit, and loaded into a secure transport van for the journey to the Blackwood Creek Youth Detention Center. He stared out the reinforced window as the van left the city, the world sliding by. He saw it all as his kingdom, temporarily out of reach. He began planning his memoir in his head. Back in the courtroom, as the chaos subsided, Arthur Caldwell stood. He didn't watch them lead his son's killer away. He looked down at his phone. His thumb hovered over a single unlabeled icon, a custom app he'd designed himself. It contained one button. For weeks, he had waited, the final piece of his blueprint dormant, waiting for the legal system to run its course. He had given it every chance to deliver true justice. It had failed. With a calm that was more terrifying than any outburst, he tapped the screen. A single, encrypted command was sent. It wasn't a message to a person. It was a signal to a machine. A signal that had been waiting patient as a stone in the structural operating system of the Blackwood Creek facility. A system he, as the lead architect, had helped design. The van arrived at Blackwood Creek. It was a modern low-slung building of concrete and steel, designed to be both secure and, in the brochures, rehabilitative. Leo was led inside, the electronic doors buzzing shut behind him. He was in the intake area, a sterile, brightly lit space with a polished concrete floor. He was still composing the first chapter of his memoir when he felt it. A deep, groaning shudder, like a giant waking beneath the earth. The lights flickered. A fine dust sifted from the ceiling. A guard looked up, confused. The hell was that? Then came the sound. A series of sharp percussive cracks, like bones breaking, followed by a low, gathering roar. It was the sound of reinforced concrete failing, of steel tendons snapping under a stress they were never meant to bear. Arthur, in his design, had included a hidden flaw. A single, central support column, vital to the building's integrity, whose foundation was not a solid pier, but a complex hydraulic mechanism. It was a failsafe, designed to stabilize the building in case of seismic activity. But Arthur had also designed a secret, secondary command to that mechanism. A command to retract. The floor beneath Leo's feet suddenly heaved. The ceiling tiles fell in a shower of dust and fiberglass. The far wall bulged inward, then exploded as a slab of concrete broke loose. The roar was deafening now, a beast consuming itself. Alarms blared, adding to the cacophony. Leo was thrown to the floor. His smug superiority vanished, replaced by raw, animal terror. He scrambled, clawing at the smooth concrete as the world disintegrated around him. He saw a guard crushed by a falling beam. He saw the sky where a ceiling had been. This wasn't random. This was precise. This was architectural. And in that moment of absolute, physical terror, he understood. This wasn't an accident. This was a final, devastating equation solved. The variable he had failed to account for, the quiet, patient architect, had not been playing the legal game. He had been redesigning the board. As the intake room collapsed in on itself, as the weight of the entire structure bore down, Leo Thorne's last conscious thought wasn't of his own genius. It was of Arthur Caldwell's face in the courtroom window. Not angry. Not grieving. Resolved. The unthinkable had happened. Justice hadn't been served by the court. It had been delivered by a man who understood that to break a flawless structure, you simply remove its keystone. And then you let gravity do the rest. Back in the city, the news broke instantly. Breaking. Structural collapse at Blackwood Creek Youth Facility. Casualties feared. The story dominated every screen, a fresh tragedy layered on top of the first. In the Caldwell living room, the television was on. Helen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a new, complicated horror. She looked at her husband. Arthur was standing by the window, looking out at the quiet street. He didn't look at the TV. He didn't react to the news. He had known the moment it happened. He had felt it, a final, silent click in the universe. His phone rang. It was Detective Morales. He let it go to voicemail. He could picture the scene with brutal, architectural clarity. The dust, the panic, the twisted rebar. And somewhere in the center of it, the boy. The brilliant, arrogant variable, erased by the one force he couldn't outlogic, physics. There was no celebration in Arthur. No triumphant smile. There was only a vast, quiet emptiness. A problem that had consumed him was now solved. The equation was balanced. The flawed support beam had been removed, and the unstable structure it sustained had, as he knew it would, collapsed under its own weight. He thought of Leo in that final second. Not with hatred, but with a kind of cold, professional acknowledgement. The boy had been right about one thing. The world was a system of cause and effect. Leo had introduced a cause, the murder of Benji. And Arthur had simply calculated the effect. He had not become a monster. He had become a function. A tool of inevitable justice. He had operated outside of their sentimental, flawed legal system and had worked within the pure, unshakable laws of structural engineering. Helen was crying now, confused sobs of grief and shock and a terrible, dawning understanding. Arthur walked over to her. He didn't try to explain. He simply put a hand on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of connection. A shared burden. The world would call it a terrible accident. A coincidence of tragic proportions. They would investigate, and they would find a flaw in the hydraulic stabilizer system. A 1 in a million failure. They might even blame his firm's design. But they would never ever trace it back to the quiet, grieving man in Crestmere Bluffs. They wouldn't understand the language he had spoken. The language of concrete and force. He had looked directly into the abyss of Leo's mind, and he had responded not with emotion, but with a greater, more absolute logic. He had given the monster a lesson it could never have learned in any courtroom, that for all his intellectual posturing, he was still just a fragile, physical thing. And in the end, every single thing, no matter how brilliant, is subject to the laws of gravity. In the days that followed, a new kind of silence settled over Crestmere Bluffs. It wasn't the heavy, pressurized quiet of secrets anymore. It was the hollow, wind-swept silence of a field after a fire. The news trucks packed up and left. The story of the boy genius killer was replaced by the tragedy of the Blackwood Creek collapse. A 1 in a million structural failure. A terrible accident. The Thornes, broken twice over, moved away. The Caldwell house stayed, but the bike was gone from the yard. The laughter was a memory. And Arthur? He still walks the perfectly manicured streets. He still nods to his neighbors. But he walks with a different weight now. Not the weight of grief, but the weight of a secret so absolute it has become a part of his skeleton. He didn't get revenge. He performed a correction. He balanced an equation. He goes to his architectural firm every day. He designs buildings. And in every blueprint, in every calculation of stress and load, he sees the unshakable truth he proved, that the universe, in the end, operates on a simple, brutal logic. Cause and effect. We look for monsters in the shadows, in the strange and the obviously broken. But the most dangerous monster is the one that believes it's a god. And the most dangerous force isn't a monster at all. It's a quiet man with a blueprint, who has nothing left to love, and therefore, nothing left to lose. So the next time you're in a quiet, perfect place, and you feel a shudder in the ground beneath your feet, remember the story of Leo Thorne and Arthur Caldwell. Remember that for every arrogant action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Sometimes, that reaction doesn't wear a badge. It doesn't speak in a courtroom.